Hello out there. This is Heather Vickery. I'm your host here at the Brave Files podcast. How are all you brave folks doing out there today? I am so happy that you decided to tune in today because this episode is such a treat. I cannot wait to share it with you. But before we start the show, I'm excited to let you know that this is our first episode dedicated to one of our Patreon supporters. This week, we are honoring Courtney Hammonds. She was one of our very first patron supporters, and I am so excited to dedicate the show to her. Courtney has requested that the episode actually be dedicated to her two beautiful sons, Taraku and Tedros. Courtney said these little ones whom she adopted from East Africa are the bravest people she knows. So the show goes out to all three of you, Courtney, Taraku, and Tedros. What about you? Would you like to have an episode dedicated to you or a loved one? If you become a patron on our Patreon page at the level of $8 a month or higher, this is one of your rewards. Patron tiers start at just $4 a month, and we really do count on your support to keep the show going week after week. There are many wonderful rewards available at all different levels, so please go and check it out now at patreon.com/bravefiles. Remember that we cannot do it without your support. Okay, folks, buckle up and get ready for an exceptional episode, and here's today's show.
Passion, principle, voices.
You are listening to The Brave Files, real stories from people living courageously. You can listen to the show anywhere you enjoy podcasts, and we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does make a difference, and we appreciate it. Now here's your host, Heather Vickery.
Hello, listeners. It's Heather Vickery, your host here at the Brave Files podcast. So I have to ask you, have you started your gratitude practice yet? If you have, I want to know how it's going for you. And if you haven't, what's stopping you? You can reach out to me at heather@vickeryandco.com for guidance or to share your excitement about how gratitude has changed your life, or on support to develop a gratitude practice that is powerful, and I promise you're going to see results. Remember to grab a copy of my book, Gratitude Journal, Shift Your Focus, and if you already have a copy, buy one for a friend. You can purchase the book today on Amazon.com, and again, we will have links in the show notes. All right, let's get to today's show. Today's guest is Ilana Landsberg-Lewis. She spent her entire adult life engaged in the struggle for the rights of women and girls. She's worked as a human rights and labor lawyer through her years at the United Nations Development Fund for Women and with women's groups around the world. Ilana was one of the co-founders of the UN Gay and Lesbian Rights Organization, and these are just a few of the outstanding things she has done in her career. In 2006, she launched the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign with grandmothers in Canada to support dignified, courageous African grandmothers raising children orphaned by the AIDS crisis. And the Grandmothers campaign has now gone global, and it's headed to the U.S. We're going to hear all about it. In 2012, she received the YWCA Women of Distinction Award and was named one of the top 25 women of influence in Canada. She also hosts a podcast called Grandmothers on the Move, and I'm excited to share that with you. And wow, that's a lot. Ilana, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Heather. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Wow, what a history you have here.
It sounds impressive on paper, for sure.
It does sound impressive on paper, and it sounds like you've really dedicated your life to some spectacular work.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to work with some extraordinary women and learn from them and pursue what is really passionate for me, being on the planet.
I love that. So what led you to this type of work? How did you find yourself in this space?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been thinking about it and preparing to talk to you today, which is that when I was young, I was a very, very shy and quiet young person, almost pathologically shy. Wow. And it took this burning passion I had to be involved in the world of human rights and women's rights and girls' rights in particular, to push me out of that place of almost paralyzation around my own voice. I think that's why I care so much about other women's voices. And I come from a family that's been involved in social justice work forever. So I had all of
So it's in your blood.
It's in my blood. I think there'd be instant human combustion if I didn't do something in that vein. But I watched them around me speaking and working so hard for the rights of people around us, and couldn't find my own way to my own voice, and eventually did, just because I knew I couldn't do the work I wanted to do if I couldn't get past that shyness.
Oh, I love that. There's so much power in the why, pushing us to do the hard thing. And if for you, the hard thing was to get out from underneath your shyness so you could create this change that was important to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really true.
It's a great lesson. This is the Brave Files, y'all. So there are all sorts of ways to motivate you to choose bravely. And I think, I don't know that we've ever talked about it in that way, that the thing that you're so passionate about can drive change in our personalities and our behaviors. So
yes, actually, and I haven't thought about it that way, but it was because I was thinking of the Brave Files. I was thinking, well, the first act of true bravery in my young life was stepping out of my own self-imposed shell, and not so much anxiety, but just fear of my own voice, and stepping into any kind of limelight, and that took courage.
It takes a lot of courage. And you said something I find really interesting, especially for a woman who says she was raised in a household that was dedicated to human rights and social justice, afraid to hear your own voice. And often when I hear women say that, it's pretty easy to identify that that's because we live in this patriarchal society. And yet your family background, at least from our brief conversation so far, seems to counter that. What do you think led to you having a fear or desire to repress your own voice?
That's an interesting question. My mother was a feminist journalist in the national press, so she definitely was exercising a voice on behalf of other women. And I was brought up to feel powerful, or to aspire to the kind of power that comes from self-actualization and taking your place in the world and owning it, not being afraid to take up space. I think that I was very political, and growing up in a political family, and at home I was certainly voluble. I wasn't silent.
Right.
But I think that I think you're quite right when you talk about a patriarchal context, that whether we feel it every day now or whether we see it, certainly it exists. And although I was encouraged in my young life to develop my voice and use my voice, when I stepped out into the world, the same fortification, the same validation and affirmation of my thoughts, my young thoughts, and my political fervor were out of step with what was happening around me.
Yeah.
And so I felt, I think I felt what I hear from a lot of grandmothers, actually, when I speak to them about how in their young lives, that fear of disapproval, the worry about not being in step or not speaking in a way that would be easily accepted. I think I internalized that fear. And I think, to be honest, that part of the reason that I was fearful was because I knew I had strong, opinionated things that I felt and wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so powerful to me, really powerful to think that, and a little, I don't know, anxiety inducing on my part. I have 4 daughters, and I hope and believe that I'm raising them the way you were raised. And we get this false sense of security that we're going to be turning young women into the world that know that they don't have to follow those rules. And yet when those rules are written everywhere, it's really a challenge.
Yes, it is. And I think that it's more of a challenge than we realize, because the culture that nurtures girls, not necessarily the parents. You're obviously not doing that, Heather, and I don't do that either. But and I wasn't raised that way. But the culture that nurtures girls still, even though we talk a lot about girl power and girls' voices, the culture still focuses an enormous amount on acceptance.
Yeah.
And I think we're breaking through that. I think when you see the Emma Gonzalez's and the other young women who are raising voices in so many different ways, I think Me Too helps. I think there are many ways in which girl power is terrific and it sounds great. But what we're asking young women and girls to do is to take that power themselves, to embody it. And I don't think it's putting undue pressure. I think that young girls and young women want to step into that place and often do. But I think that the culture has to catch up. And I think that the pressure to be accepted and also speak truth to your own power is tough. And I stand in great admiration of young women who are doing that and claiming that voice long before, at an earlier age than I was able to.
Absolutely. It is tough. My oldest is 14. She is a fierce feminist, whether that is from osmosis with me or she's made her own decisions. In fact, a couple of years ago, she asked me that. She said, Mama, the things that I think are right, do I think they're right because I think they're right, or do I think they're right because you think they're right? I was like, well, now that's a good question, isn't it? So she's really a deep thinker. All of my girls are. You know, she'll go to bat on dress code. If my shoulders are keeping that boy from doing a good job on his math test, that's his problem, not mine. But, you know, if she's not getting the social attention that she wants in school, she feels less than worthy, less than valuable. And the struggle is real.
Yes, it is. And I think that we've come such a long way that it's often hard to see the road ahead as far, right? Because things, when I hear my mother talk, or even women of my generation, we've come so far from those old days of most of women's power coming from our sexual power or from how people perceive us, the pressure that we have to look a certain way, to conform. And yet, although we've come eons beyond those days, which feel prehistoric to me now, you know, and I hope they remain that way. But I think that makes it a little harder perhaps to see how much further we have yet to go, and we do. And a lot of that is around education, and a lot of it is, when you look around you, there are more and more women who represent the kind of voices, the kind of power, the kind of intersectionality of that power. It's not all white women now.
Thank goodness.
Is really important. Thank goodness. The huge stride forward that are taking up those spaces and articulating important values and politics and principles and working in diverse professions. But they're still not equally represented. We're still not equally represented. And I think that girls have a lot more to look to these days, and thank goodness for that. And I also think that it's, although Me Too has been painful and difficult and has not yet translated into action as much. Although
unfortunately,
words are actions, so breaking silence is an action, but transformative action, I think, is what I'm talking about. I still think that too has been, in the contemporary sense, has taken us even further ahead than we were before. It's not an individual struggle. I think that's the key. That's what I've learned over my lifetime of work. It's not about any one individual coming into our own, much as we want that. It is systemic change we're looking at.
Absolutely systemic. Absolutely. So you touched base on sexual power, which is something that comes up a lot in my household. We'll watch historic films or documents, and I'll explain, like, okay, do you know why these women felt that they had to behave this way or make these choices in order to stay alive and protect their loved ones? But we've had a recent experience where my daughters were out with my mom, who's wonderful. I love her. She's amazing. Mom, if you're listening, you're amazing. But a much older, in fact, I would venture to say old man, was ogling my 14-year-old, who's a beautiful, beautiful young woman. And she said to my mom, that man keeps looking at me and I don't like it. I don't feel comfortable. And my mom's response was, oh, he must just think you're pretty.
Right.
Like, I was like, I wasn't there, but my kid called me right away. And she's like, I don't know what to do about this. I don't like this situation. And I don't feel like I was supported. And so she's got it. She's right. Like, no, you don't. That's not okay, and it's not okay just because somebody thinks you're pretty. You don't have to accept that. But of course, my mom's of the generation that if somebody wants to give you attention, doesn't matter what kind of attention is, you take it.
Right. And somebody looking at you because they think you're pretty can be taken as a compliment. And many women of that generation were raised to think that way. But I also think that there were very few avenues open to expressing your own discomfort. So I would bet that your mother experienced that as a young woman too, and felt equally uncomfortable and maybe even equally indignant.
Yeah.
But there was no acceptable way to express that indignation or the sort of diminution of your person by just being seen as a pretty girl. You were supposed to be flattered, but if you weren't, and I don't think most women were when they were being ogled, as they are now, there really wasn't a way to express it that was conventionally acceptable. So you either had to step way outside the convention and pay the consequences, or you conformed. And I think that even those of us who were raised feminists have those moments where it's not just, oh, do I really have to do this again? Or, oh, do I have to really fight today? I have lots of those moments too. But I think that we have those, I'm not going to say it's built into our DNA because I refuse to accept that. But I think
it's habitual, though. It's built into our life experience.
Absolutely. And you have those reflexive moments where you think, oh, just smile and pay the change and walk away at the counter or whatever, wherever it happens. Or if you're speaking to someone you don't know, and it can happen in an airport, it can happen anywhere. And and I think we still have those reflexive moments where even now, those of us who are proud to be feminists and women's rights activists still think now and then, oh, just walk away or turn the other cheek. And I think that it takes a lot of energy from women, and thank goodness that so many have it and are willing to dedicate it to the betterment of the human condition, that we name it every time it happens, or almost every time it happens, that we name it. And bravo for your daughter to check in with someone who she knows understands what she felt and would support her feeling. Because if you can't get it in the moment, what I think is happening more and more that gives me great encouragement for the present and the future is that now, even if the person you're with or the immediate network of people may not share your impulse, you know where to go as a young woman. There are a lot of young women, and not enough, but a lot of young women now have resources beyond the immediate if they need them.
Absolutely. It's been an ongoing struggle for me to try to educate my mom on how to not sexualize my daughters. Like, we've had to have conversations like, please don't tell the 5-year-old she looks really sexy in that outfit. Or, it goes on. And my older kids look at me, and again, my mom's an amazing person, but that's how she's been trained to compliment and to feel valuable. And the reconditioning of that is like an ongoing, never-ending process. And in that situation, with that man who was making my daughter uncomfortable, I had to say to her, that's not the response she was looking for. She was looking for you to protect her and tell her that she didn't have to be uncomfortable in a situation and to get up and walk away. So. Yeah,
and I think for your mom too, and for friends and extended family, and community, the reality is that we're constantly experiencing these teachable moments, as parenting gurus say, where it's not just for the younger generation. We also, I recently, actually a few years ago, my mother and I, because my mother really was a huge influence in how I have 2 boys, so they're both feminist men.
Love that.
Young men, yep. They're 14 and 17, and they're passionate about equality and gender equality. And my mother and I were reading something, and we both had this epiphany where it said, instead of saying to your children every time they do something wonderful, which is, in your opinion, all the time, often, instead of saying to them, oh, I'm so proud of you, oh, that's so wonderful, oh, that actually what you're telling them when you do that is that they should be striving for your approval.
Yeah.
because they bask in it and it's so warm and loving and they know it comes from an appreciative, loving place. But rather try saying to your children, oh, that must feel really wonderful that you mastered that. Or, oh, you must feel, how do you feel about that painting that you did? Or, and we both had this epiphany and thought, oh, maybe it's too late. We've already honed them to turn themselves to the light and the warmth of our own approval, as opposed to taking pride in their own achievements, looking for our sense of feeling proud of them. So I think, even when you step outside of gender equality, there are norms around how we build this culture where we're looking outside of ourselves for approval. So it's also boys, although for me gender equality is the passion around this, but it's not, all of our cultural norms are built for this outside approval and acceptance. And that is where I started in our conversation. As someone who was deeply affected by that, because I lived with extraordinarily courageous, iconoclastic parents. I mean, they bucked every convention. There was no stone.
Them. Mine did not.
Mine did, and there was no stone left unturned. And everything was up for questioning, and they were passionate about everything and encouraged us to be the same. And even with parents like that, it took me time to find my own feet.
Yeah. That's all great. So much great stuff. I really love the gift that you gave us of, instead of praising, having them touch in intuitionally with how that feels to them. That is such a powerful thing. And while I believe I've tried to do that in a lot of ways, perhaps not with praise. And so I'm really going to take that away from this conversation. Thank you for that. So how old were you when you first became involved in this fight for equality and gender equality?
Well, I started awfully young, to be honest, because my father was in politics and my mother was a writer. So I was knocking on doors with my dad when I was 7 years old.
I love that.
And he was part of the Democratic Left, the Labour Party in Canada, the equivalent. And so I grew up with it, and as a youngster, I was engaged with it. When I really stepped into my own involvement, separate from all of that life stuff in my family, I was in my 20s. And it wasn't really until my 20s, I was in law school by that time, when I started to not develop my voice, because in my family we were constantly engaged and I was, as I said, speaking, but my external and sort of public expression of my own belief systems and what I wanted to fight for or be a part of. And I started working I was working at a legal aid clinic as a student, and I worked with domestic workers and women who were experiencing domestic violence. And I started to expand my own exposure and my own understanding of women's experiences in the world and in my world and in my community, and also to understand the differentials in class and race and access to services and access to privilege. And that began to shape my view of things substantially. And then I decided to look outside my own context of my own country and see, well, I'm so engaged with this whole human project and urgent human project of human rights and women's rights. What's happening elsewhere in the world?
I love that. I think you were way ahead of the curve. Maybe not. Maybe because you're Canadian and Americans have it backwards. I don't know. But, it's only been the last few years that I've been having really powerful conversations around privilege and socioeconomic needs and, how we don't all start from A. So I love that you were doing that. I would love to talk for a moment about your work with the UN, forming the Gay and Lesbian Rights Organization. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, sure. Well, I started off, I just lucked out into a marvelous job with what was then the United Nations Development Fund for Women. It's now UN Women. And
Okay.
it's the parallel to UNICEF. We all know UNICEF, it works for children in the developing world. UNIFEM was the Organization for Women's Development and Women's Rights in the Developing World at the United Nations. And I had a wonderful job there working with women's rights groups all over the world. And I learned more from them than they ever got from me. But it was a tremendous opportunity. And as an employee of the United Nations, and I've been a very out lesbian ever since I came out. It's part of the continuum of women's rights and human rights. I was very shocked to learn from colleagues at the UN that, the UN, all of the policies that guide UN employees are made by the governments that make up the United Nations. And some of those governments are very friendly to gender equality and LGBT rights, and some less so, many less so.
Yeah.
Many less so. And so the rights or the policies governing UN employees dictated by those or prescribed by those governments were breathtakingly discriminatory. Now it's changed over time. It's still far from perfection, far from nirvana at the UN for gay and lesbian LGBTQ employees. But when I was there were no rights for LGBTQ employees of the UN. And I was really stunned by that. And I thought, we have to do something about it. And I spoke to several friends who are also UN employees, also from the LGBTQ community. It was a very interesting response. There were a couple who said, yep, let's do it. Let's set up an organization or some kind of group. And the majority came to me quietly and said, are you out of your mind? You'll lose your job and you'll put our jobs in jeopardy.
Yeah. That was a real threat.
Yes, people were living in real fear, and longtime employees, very senior employees at the United Nations were living in fear, and they were living in secrecy. And, part of it was because I was young and I didn't intend at the time to make a career at the United Nations. I didn't have an ambition. I ended up staying there for a decade, but it wasn't my initial plan.
Okay.
But part of it was also that I had grown up in a different generation, and I deeply believed that, and I had a lot of privilege coming from Canada in terms of what was happening here around LGBTQ rights. And so I just felt deeply that there was more danger in the secrecy and the fear, personal danger and political danger, than there was coming forward. And I felt that I could do that and personally, and that I wanted to do it. And so I got together with a couple of other people and suggested to them that we form what became known as UN Globe, the UN LGBTQ rights organization, which still exists today. And today I see it's large, and they have representatives all over the world. And they've come so far from our little beleaguered group. And when we first started, we were not allowed to meet on UN grounds.
Wow.
Everyone kept tearing down we had tiny little notices of the elevators, and they would be defaced and torn down. We were not allowed to meet on, and I'll tell you, some might be interested that Kofi Annan was the Secretary General at the time. And I went to him as the first president of UN Globe, and I said to him, look, we went to the clubs, the groups where you start groups or clubs for UN employees. Yeah. And I was told categorically, we don't qualify and we can't meet on UN grounds, and we keep getting kicked out. And he intervened.
Wow.
And said, no, this is not right. And this is an important cause. And as a result, we were able to meet officially as an official group in the UN compound. And that was extraordinarily meaningful.
That is extraordinarily meaningful. And we just lost him last year. Tragic loss.
Real loss.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I divert a little. I'm really curious, and if this crosses your line, your boundary, then feel free to not answer the question. But coming from such a left-leaning family, what was coming out like for you? My story is, I came out at 38 after a decade of marriage and 4 kids. So my story is very different. But
you know what? No, I'm laughing because my story is not the story that one normally hears. But in fact, I had always dressed in dresses and very early on started wearing high heels, mostly because I was putting myself through university by waitressing in cocktail nightclubs. I'm short, so I started
I feel your
wearing high
pain.
heels. Yeah, I started wearing high heels, and my parents were very distressed by this because my mother kept buying me overalls and fire trucks for my birthday. Because she had been such a rebel as a youngster in the 50s when everyone was wearing cashmere sweater sets, at least in Canada. My mother was wearing jeans and refused to wear makeup. And so she'd always been such a rebel. So I'm the eldest in my family. And so when she had her own girl as her first child, she gave me all the pleasures and freedoms that she never had.
I love that.
And I, of course, as the typical daughter of a feminist, tortured her.
Wanted to be girly.
That's right. Dresses and patent leather shoes. And she was consternated by it, but it was probably my only rebellion. I fell about 1 centimeter away from the tree, or one inch away from the tree. But she and my father were both concerned that I was conforming to these conventional gender norms. And they would often raise it with me. But at the same time, politically, I was as ardent as they were about all of the issues that we cared about, human rights and gender equality. And so they weren't worried about my mind. They were worried about my conformity.
Right. I like your parents.
They were terrific. So when I came out, I'll tell you the story, whether you include it or not is up to you, but I think it's hilarious. I had been with I was young when I was in my early 20s when I came out, but I'd had boyfriends before. My parents had never particularly liked my boyfriends or approved of them, and didn't think they were good enough for me. And when I finally fell in love with a woman, I knew I was a lesbian, and she stayed overnight. This is a little racy, but here's the truth. Oh,
it's okay. We can handle it.
Okay, good. She stayed overnight. It was my first lesbian experience, and she stayed overnight and. First full lesbian experience. And she stayed overnight. And the first thing I did the next morning was pick up the phone and call my mother. And my lover, then girlfriend of many years, said to me, "Oh no, honey, don't do that. Don't call your mom right away. Maybe you need to think about this for a bit first." And I said, "Oh no, are you kidding? I have to tell my mom right away. This is wonderful. I've known for so long, and I've finally consummated the deal." And I picked up the phone, called my mother, and my mother was running out to do an interview because she was a journalist. And she said, "Oh, honey, so sorry. Can't talk now. Got to run. Late for an interview." And I said, "No, Mom, I have really important news." And she said, "Okay, I really don't have time." And I said, "Okay, fine. I'm a lesbian. And I slept with someone last night, and I'm a lesbian, and I know it, and I feel great." And she said, "Oh, wonderful, honey. How exciting," and hung up. And
that's awesome.
The woman who I stayed with for many years afterwards looked at me and said, "Oh, don't feel bad. I know it didn't go well. She hung up on you, but they'll come around." And I invited her to dinner to meet my parents. A couple of days later, she said, "Absolutely no way." Her parents were not accepting. And so she said, "There's no way I'm going in as the woman who you're coming out with." And I said, no, they'll love it. So she did eventually become a part of my family, but not that night. And I walked home, and as I walked in the door, my parents were doing a little happy dance. They looked like complete goofballs. They're quite serious people of gravitas, but they look like complete goofballs dancing around. And my father said, "Oh, thank God. Such bad taste in men. Now you'll have partners who are worthy of you." And then my mother looked at me and said, "Oh, now you'll have cute, wonderful butch girlfriends. And I was always worried about you, but now I know you're just femme."
Oh, that's amazing.
And I looked at them and I thought, this is crazy. I'll never be able to tell anyone the story of my coming out because they'll just hate me.
No, it's so It's so nice to know that those types of conversations were happening parallel to the kinds of conversations your then girlfriend was having with her family. So I think that that's lovely. I have to tell you, I would really like for you to write a memoir. Could you? I would really like to read it.
Well, thank you.
So I hope you're thinking about it.
I not quite yet. I feel that I haven't done enough yet, but maybe one day.
I'm currently reading Justice Sotomayor's memoir.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
This is totally random, and I do have relevant questions to you, but she talks about how it's a memoir and not a biography, and what the differences are, and that it's her memory and her her experiences as she recalls them. And she ends the book when she gets her first judgeship. And she said, because at that point, I had completed a phase of my life and I had entered a new one. And I haven't completed the judgeship phase of my life yet. So there isn't anything for me to reflect on.
Wow.
And I thought it was really powerful. So speaking to you saying, I don't think I've done enough yet, you can always write a second one.
That's right. I'd have to stop working for a while.
I know, for a hot minute, I'm sure.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so speaking of working, you've done so many things, but I would love to know what led you down the grandmother path. You did or you do Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign. I want to hear more about that, and then you have your podcast, which is also about grandmothers. So, what pushed you in that direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it was life itself. So I left the United Nations to start a charitable foundation with my father. Mm-hmm. And he had been appointed by Kofi Annan as the first UN Special Envoy, the first UN Special Envoy on AIDS in Africa. This was in the early 2000s when the AIDS pandemic was at its nadir in Africa. No drugs were available and people were dying in the millions. Yeah. And my father, now, as I mentioned, we come from a leftist family, so we have no means of our own. Right. So we didn't start a foundation because we had, bunches of money sitting around. He felt desperate that he was going from village to village, community to community, city to city, country to country in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where HIV and AIDS was most prevalent. And so little money was flowing to the grassroots, where people were really struggling with life and dying with dignity. And so I left my job at the UN to start working with him to set up this foundation to raise awareness about what was happening, but fundamentally to raise funds to get directly into the hands of Indigenous community-based organizations, and not intermediaries, and not to do our own programs and run our own things, but with a deep belief that it was the communities themselves who were the front lines of the AIDS pandemic who knew best what it was going to take to overcome it. And overwhelmingly, these organizations were just popping up out of necessity, were being started by women, and women living positively with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. And so how did grandmothers come about? Well, when you had millions of people dying, and those people were young people in their productive years, as they call them, who were contracting the virus en masse, you had millions of young adults dying, leaving behind their children. And
tragedy.
Terrible tragedy, and particularly breathtaking because it was so unnecessary. The funds just took so long to flow. Even now, only 50% of the people who need the life-saving drugs for HIV have access to them in Africa. So what happened was that it was the grandmothers, these just indomitable, determined, and grief-stricken grandmothers who would bury 1 to 5 of their adult children within the span of just a year or two, and then get up the next morning with yet more grandchildren who were orphaned, who were just in an agony of loss, having lost their parents. Yeah. And now the grandmothers, without time to grieve appropriately for their own adult children, had to turn around and nurture these young and really sad and bereft orphaned grandchildren. So they would take in, you would find grandmothers with first 2 or 3 and then 5 and sometimes as many as 10 or 15 children under their roofs. Wow. And these are their grandchildren, so they could be 2-year-olds, 1-year-olds, and 12-year-olds. Right. So you had these grandmothers who were parenting again, but parenting in a completely different context. And with so little support and practically invisible, well, I shouldn't say practically, completely invisible in the narrative around HIV and AIDS internationally, certainly, but even in their own countries, so little recognition of what was happening in these families being torn apart.
Yeah. And in even women in general.
That's right.
Are not well respected. Yeah.
No, and women have been have been the most infected and affected, and they've been at the epicenter of the response to AIDS in Africa overwhelmingly. And the men who work at community level say this as well. They're completely aware of it. So in 2006, we kept hearing more and more stories of this. It was coming back to us from our community-based partners, and I had just, I had a young baby. I'd just given birth to my second child, and I was watching my mother, who, you know, as I've mentioned, was a pretty tough mama. She was an activist, a feminist, you know, and, you know, she was a strong and independent. To me, she was the strongest person in the world. And when I watched her with my two little children, in 2005, my second child was just turning a year old. And I thought, what has happened to my tiger mama? She is just like a bowl of jello with my children. She adores them. And every wink, every goo, every poop was like genius, you know? And I thought, this is so hilarious. She's completely transformed. And I had this personal epiphany in that moment that there's something about grandmotherhood that I never understood, and I still didn't understand, that was so powerful and yet different from the overwhelming, profound, deep well and obsessiveness of mother love. This was quite different. And I thought to myself, you know, surely if grandmothers in Canada, where I live, if grandmothers in Canada knew what grandmothers in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, the burden that they were carrying and the responsibility that they were carrying to keep the next generation not just alive, but nurture them back into hope and optimism and vividness for their own future. You know, if grandmothers here knew what grandmothers in sub-Saharan Africa were carrying, surely it would resonate for them. And I've been given credit, but I shouldn't be. I really didn't know the extent to which grandmothers in Canada, now in Australia and the UK, and now beginning in the US, how deeply this would resonate for them, but also how much they would step up. And it was just breathtaking. And in Canada now, they've been doing this Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign with the Stephen Lewis Foundation for 11 years. They've raised $30 million.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. There's over the last 10 years, there's been over 250 groups of grandmothers across Canada. Each group has its own identity, its own activities, its own name. They're all part of the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign of the foundation. And they all have different likes and dislikes. So some groups do crafts and they make quilts and beautiful bags, and some groups have no interest in crafts. So they do, you know, there's a group of grandmothers in Victoria, British Columbia. They do this, I'm not going to get it right, but they do over 70-kilometer bicycle marathon. And
oh my gosh, I love those grannies.
Oh my goodness, they're 70 and 80 years old, and they raise $100,000. And there's a group in Alberta that does a Scrabble tournament. They raised $100,000 in one night.
Wow.
So these grandmothers groups started raising funds. But you know, Heather, the most extraordinary dimension to the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign on the North American side of the equation, I think for me, and why I decided to do a podcast too, was because the grandmothers, unlike a lot of us in North America, where we've grown up in this culture of philanthropy, where you're saving people and you're helping people, and if you don't give money now, this child's not going to make it, and you put pictures of children on your fridge, and they're your child in whatever country or community.
Right.
You know, in our foundation, we believed so deeply in the dignity and the intelligence of the African women in particular themselves and the communities themselves. And so how were we going to translate that here with the grandmothers? And actually for the Canadian grandmothers and for all the grandmothers involved in the campaign globally now, it wasn't a huge leap for them to embrace the reality that the African grandmothers don't need to be adopted, don't need to be saved. They're the agents of change in their communities with their families, and they're dignified, thoughtful, determined older women. And for the Canadian grandmothers, where it first started this campaign, you know, they also had gone through this experience of becoming kind of invisible as they age, not being seen as elder. Sure. I always make this joke: men become elder statesmen, women become grannies, and grannies isn't always a promotion.
Yeah.
So the Canadian grandmothers, it wasn't a huge step. There's grandmothers and grandothers, I should say that, because there's women who join who are grandmothers but don't have grandchildren.
Yeah.
And it wasn't hard for them to make that leap to say, you know what, this is not charity, this is solidarity.
You know, that's to me such an important distinction in any type of human rights work.
Yes.
There's this whole white savior phenomenon thing, which some folks want to get really bent out of shape with me about, but I think it's really important. We are not the agents of change. We are supporting and helping those that have the ability and should be the agents of change. I think that's a really lovely distinction. What a phenomenal project. I have to say, so not a grandmother, grandfather, my dad, my stepdad actually, but greatest dad ever, was kind of a pain in the ass when we were growing up. And he was a difficult human being, and he's fully aware of it. And he is, like you were mentioning about your mother, he's an outstanding grandfather. And I remember when my oldest was pretty little still, he looked at me with just this complete awe in his eyes. And he said, the thing about being a grandparent is that I'm not their parent. I'm not responsible for how well they turn out or what happens in their life. I only have to love them. The rest of it is your job.
That's right. And actually, one of the things, we produced this book called Powered by Love, A Grandmother's Movement to End AIDS in Africa. And the book is essentially interviews with hundreds and hundreds, over 800 African grandmothers, but then interviews with hundreds of Canadian grandmothers about the campaign. And one of the things that grandmother after grandmother said was that, and I really love this, I learned something. What I've come to realize in my own work is how much, it's why I said at the beginning, voices were so important to me, that really listening to people at the front lines of their own struggle and understanding that there's, as you said, the agents of change and the experts, that it gives you so many insights. And one of the things that I learned was that, you know, the African grandmothers are not self-conscious about love at all, about using the word. You know, here sometimes it can be touchy-feely or kind of a Hallmark card, something beautiful and nice, but not necessarily an engine for change. And one of the things that the African grandmothers have taught all of us, and certainly the Canadian grandmothers understand this, have embraced it, feel it themselves, that love that grandmothers and grandparents feel is actually capable of great transformative power. That it's sustaining, that it can keep you going when it's almost impossible to imagine carrying on, and that it has this tremendous transformative power, but also that the relationship of grandparent, grandmother to grandchild is so different, and that it doesn't in any way undermine the love of a mother or a father, but it is qualitatively different. And as your father said, it has a different function. It plays a different role. And the African grandmothers who have now stepped in as parents again, so they're back in a parenting role. So. Their love is sustaining the next a whole nation. Their love is sustaining the next generation, and that love is being employed as sort of the engine of motherhood that raises kids, but they're grandmothers. And it has a different tenor, it has a different feeling to it. And so many grandmothers I speak to tell me this, that like your father said quite rightly, that they don't have the anxiety of parenthood. Is this kid going to be a good person?
There's no pressure there.
Are they going to be good? How do they reflect on me? Am I doing a good job? You know, are they doing their homework? And grandparents let go of all of that. And what I've heard from them that I love so much, so many grandmothers have said this to me, that they can really see their grandchildren in a different way, that when they were mothers, they didn't see their children in the same way because there were so many things they were worried about and distracted by and projected onto them. But with their grandchildren, they can truly see them for the remarkable young people they are.
That's beautiful. They can really see them. What a gift. What an absolute joy. Ilana, as you've done all of these really extraordinary things, have you felt brave?
Yes, sometimes. It's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I always say, probably at least once an episode, the goal isn't to be fearless. There's a lot of strength and power behind choosing bravely.
Yes, and I like the word brave because I can't remember where I heard it. There's an adage that I always forget about the difference between overcoming fear and not feeling it, right?
Yes.
And that bravery is actually doing something in spite of or overcoming your anxiety or your fear, as opposed to not feel, just being a brave person because you don't feel any.
That's right.
And for me, that, although I think I heard it in a pretty trite context. I may even have been God forbid, a Disney film or something.
Oh,
but,
boy.
Yeah, not something I like to admit, but it it resonated powerfully for me, because I think what I've been privileged to bear witness to and every now and then be a part of in a modest way is exceptional bravery on the part of so many women and so many activists, and many women who would not consider themselves activists, but are transforming the world one family, one community, one country at a time, and changing everything from societal norms to the way their own children are coming into the world. And for me, I've had a few precious moments in life where I've had to overcome challenges to do what I want to do. And I interviewed this one woman, Peggy Antrobus, who's a towering women's rights activist from the Caribbean, who said to me, when I said to her, "You're a grandmother, what would you wish for your granddaughter? What do you want to say to her?"
Great question.
She said, well, this sounds terrible, but I hope that she has just enough challenges in life that she can overcome them and see what she's capable of.
Yeah.
And I do think I have had moments, very often it's been around using my own voice, but sometimes it's been around taking a stand, even though I've grown up in a context where taking a stand is as natural as breathing. To be perfectly honest, that is not something that I had to feel very brave about, because I was brought up to do that.
Sure, yeah.
But there have been moments where the stakes felt higher, or it felt, I knew that there would be a price to pay, and it wasn't brave to take that stand necessarily. It was what was going to happen in my own life, or what was going to unfold as a result, and that took some bravery on my part. They've been few and far between, because I'm a lucky and privileged person. But when those moments have come, I've actually felt extraordinarily, this is an odd way to put it now that I'm saying it, but I felt extraordinarily grateful for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's my word.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I heard you mention gratitude. It's not a word I use often, but actually, as I get older, it's part of aging for me. It's part of the process of getting older, is that I realized that those moments of overcoming were moments where I grew into myself and grew as a person, but also, frankly, made myself more useful to others around me. That's what matters most to me.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. And that leads in very nicely to my next question, which is about celebration. And to me, gratitude and celebration are they're bosom buddies, right? They're not the same thing, but they complement each other really well. So when you've had those moments where you find yourself extremely grateful, or you've achieved something extraordinary, even if it's a little thing, but you've done all these big things, how do you celebrate those successes and those wins?
That's so interesting. No one's ever asked me that. I'm not brilliant at celebration. Of others, I love to. With my children, I take great joy in it. I'm not brilliant at those moments of celebration, but I would say this, partly it's because my work, to do what I want to do in the world, it requires me to be extroverted and to be a talker and a doer. But as an individual, I'm a quieter person, and so truthfully, those moments of celebration where I really do feel that I have accomplished something, I have two responses to it, which are my own, I guess, perhaps lame, but heartfelt attempts at celebration, I tend to be alone and to be thinking, just allow myself to reflect.
Yes, that's a huge, beautiful way to celebrate reflection.
Yeah, particularly when you're engaged in the kind of work that I do, but also the kind of work that I'm trying to support, because I'm not the one doing the real work. I live to support it. But taking those moments to reflect, they're few and far between when, as you know, when you're working and you're a mother, and there are many, many things going on in your life. And actually, those moments feel very important. And the flip side of it for me is a kind of, I guess, I'd use the word, a kind of restlessness or a kind of urgency, where at the very same moment that I think, oh, that was good, that happened, and that space opened up and those women stepped into it, or they took over that, or this transpired and I had a small part in that's something to think about, how that worked or what it was able to accomplish. At the very same moment, I usually feel, to be perfectly honest, that is also where the urgency gets a voice, because it's not about not resting on your laurels for me so much.
Sure.
It's more about those moments where you feel you've been a part of something bigger than yourself. For me, that's what really matters. That may have made a difference in some way, is the exact moment that you can dig deeper to be spurred on and energized to continue the sense of urgency and get re-energized in a way to dive right back in and figure out what worked and what else needs to happen.
I believe that is the power of celebration, and everybody celebrates differently. And I ask this question every week and I get all sorts of different answers. But the reason I ask it, and the reason when I'm coaching or speaking that I talk about it so much, is really what you just said. If we never stop to honor or reflect on the things that go well, eventually it's just too hard to push through. And what it does give you is that motivation to push on to the next thing and to try something else that may feel uncomfortable or frightening, because you can and you have.
Yeah, I like that very much. And I think it's also about finding your place in it, right? So that
absolutely,
unless it's a very individual accomplishment, and there are lots of those in life that people need to have and strive to, but very often for me, the question is, what role did you play? What role could you have played? What role do you want to play? Where do you fit in the trajectory of social change, social justice, women's rights? And I'm not talking about sort of big, amorphous, airy-fairy concepts. I'm talking about your engagement with it. And when you are engaged, there are all these moments of transformation. It's very rare that one person is the architect or the author of those moments. So that moment to celebrate is usually done in community. But what I find is that the quiet moment where you figure out where is my place in that, what do I want it to be, and what else can I do? It's an odd thing to call that celebration, but for me, that is probably the place where you get to do, or at least I'll speak for myself, where I get to do, I take just a few minutes and think deeply about what accomplishment really means, because the metrics of success and accomplishment have been so bastardized by fame and money, and the metrics suck as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah,
I totally agree. That is wonderful. So very quickly, we're way over. Thank you all for hanging in this late, but could you possibly have ended this conversation any sooner? This was so fabulous. I want you to tell everybody about your podcast, Grandmothers on the Move, quickly. What will they get and how can they find you?
Oh, lovely. Well, thank you for that, Heather. If you go to grandmothersonthemove.com, there's a website and all of the episodes are there. Of course, you can get them on iTunes and elsewhere, but you'll find all the episodes there with the pictures of the grandmothers that I've interviewed. And what you'll find is conversations much like this one, just personal, intimate conversations with grandmothers from all over the world, from Nicaragua to the Philippines to San Diego. Grandmothers who've been involved in all sorts of different and vital contributions that they're making to our families and to our societies. And they're just thrilling, actually. I have to say, Heather, they're so inspiring and they're so thrilling. And these are grandmothers just like all of our grandmothers.
Right.
And they're inspiring and they're touching and they're often hilarious. And their insights range from everything on what do you do after the revolution to how do you save the planet to how do you get your daughter to learn how to cook better food for her children without making her feel bad about herself. It's just the entire range of life experience is in those conversations. It's really been a privilege to speak to each one of them.
I love it. I love it as a concept. I think in the United States here, we are one of the most pathetic nations out there as it goes to honoring our elders and learning from them. And there is so much to learn, and these conversations are so powerful and they can create such impact. And I'm grateful that you're bringing them out there. I remember when my grandmother, at this point I have one living grandparent, but when my grandmother, my dad's mom, passed, I was in my early 20s. And I had a colleague who was in her 40s at the time say to me, it's a real shame that grandparents die because we don't really need them until we're adults. And I thought so much about that. It's true.
There's so much truth. The first interview I ever did was with my mother because I thought, well, she's the grandmother that looms largest in my life. My grandmothers are gone now, but she's the grandmother I know most closely and intimately. And she ended our conversation by saying something that has really stuck with me. And a lot of women have repeated it to me since. She said, there's an optimism in survival.
Right.
And I thought, right, that is so true, that a lot of what our grandmothers bring us, particularly as women, particularly if you care about women's rights and gender equality, for men and women, men and boys alike, our grandmothers bring us this long history of survival and getting through things and learning about and dealing with evolution and change around us. Anyway, I think about it all the time because it gives me an enormous amount of hope.
Absolutely. I love it. I think it's a great show. I want all of my listeners to go and check it out because it's really a wonderful, wonderful contribution to the conversation. So I have one final question for you.
Sure.
Which is one of my favorites. And I bet that this one gives you pause because it was hard to pick one. But what is your favorite charitable organization to support? Other than your own, because we're going to give your own. We're going to give your own props. So,
other than my own, well, gosh, that is a really tough one. There are a couple of organizations, but picking one is what you've asked me to do. Right now I'll speak in the U.S. because I suspect that's where a lot of your listeners are. I know that there are, I was interviewing a grandmother who started Grandmothers Against Gun Violence.
Yeah.
And I really think that the young people from Parkland in particular, but across the country, who have sparked a movement for young people to be able to grow up in safety and security, but actually fundamentally challenging the values that are informing the gun lobby in the States. I look to young women like Emma Gonzalez and her cohorts for a lot of hope for the future. And
Me too.
Yeah. And there are a couple of great charitable organizations that I know they're involved with in their beginning, and I would look at those. I think that informs so many other things. I could say to you the Ms. Foundation, which I love deeply, Keep a Child Alive, Alicia Keys Foundation, working with people working around HIV and AIDS in Africa, as I do. There are all sorts of tremendous organizations. But right now, I think that movement, I think, also gave power to Me Too, to anyone who stands up with extraordinary courage, tenacity, determination in the face of adversity, and demands social transformation that resonates deeply with the humanity in all of us and challenges some of the deepest held notions or values that people have that are not serving the human condition, I think that's where people should be looking to today.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And I will say, I'll put this out to the universe. I want to interview Emma Gonzalez. So if anybody out there
you and me both
has a connection to Emma, hook us up, because she is a young woman that I would really like to speak to. Thank you so much for sharing that. There were a lot of options there, listeners. And as always, I want you to go out, get to know them, find one that connects with you. If you have time or money to support them with, please do so. Otherwise, share something of theirs with someone that you know. Share it on your social media platforms. Give them a little bit of love. But we are at a time where we must come together as a community, as a world community, if we want to create change and make things better. Ilana, will you share your 3 words with us one last time?
I certainly will. It was passion, principle, and voices.
Excellent words. I feel like we touched pretty much thoroughly on all of those throughout the course of the conversation. Sometimes I use this opportunity to say, now, why did you pick that word? But I feel like we've fully vetted all of that. I have loved this conversation. We could have a whole nother hour, I think, without any trouble. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure, Heather. I'm so glad that I agreed to do this. It was wonderful to have the chance to meet you and talk to you.
Absolutely. Pleasure is all mine. Everybody, I am glad that you stuck with us here. It's a joy every week to spend my Thursday with you. If you like the show, do me a favor, subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend about it. You can find all the detailed show notes, the links to all of the wonderful things that Ilana mentioned. And I look forward to connecting with you next week. This is Heather Vickery reminding you today and always to go out and choose bravely. This episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible content includes an unmatched selection of audiobooks. Check it out for yourself and get your 30-day free trial, including 1 free audiobook. Simply visit audibletrial.com/thebravefiles and voila, free audiobooks. What could be better than that?
Thank you for listening to The Brave Files. Be sure to visit thebravefilespodcast.com to access the show notes and discover fantastic bonus content. Music composed and produced by Matt Lewis of Union Music, LLC.
Special thanks to our editor and audio mix expert, Andrew Olson. I am eternally grateful for all that he does to make each week sound so fantastic. You can hear more of Andrew's work at findandrewolson.com.